The International Space Station drifts high above Earth. Outside, the heat rises past 120 degrees Celsius. Inside, astronauts trust software that keeps them alive. But in 1999, a 15-year-old in South Florida slipped into that system. From his bedroom, no spy, no agent, just a kid with a keyboard, and a mind no one could stop. He had already breached 13 NASA computers, and the Pentagon was next. To the government, he was a threat to national security. To him, it was a challenge, pure skill, curiosity, and control. This is the story of Jonathan James. Jonathan Joseph James was born on December 12, 1983, in South Florida. While other children played outside, Jonathan was drawn to the glowing screen of the family computer. His father, a programmer, noticed the boy's fascination and tried to set limits, but Jonathan was relentless. He spent hours experimenting, learning the basics of programming, exploring the logic behind software. By the time he was 10, Jonathan had already taught himself the programming language C and the Unix operating system. He studied source code with the focus of a scholar. No rule, parental restriction, or technical obstacle could slow him down. At one point, he even replaced the family's Windows system with Linux. His parents could only watch as he bypassed security settings, installed new programs, and manipulated the computer at will. Even at a young age, Jonathan displayed a rare mix of curiosity, skill, and determination. He sought challenges not to harm, but to master. The digital world became his playground, each line of code a puzzle to solve. His obsession with computers began to create tension at home. Arguments were frequent, but nothing could stop his drive. By his early teens, Jonathan was no longer just a curious child. He had become a prodigy. His abilities were far beyond those of his peers. Small systems were easy. The bigger, the more complex, the more they drew him in. The world of digital security was about to meet someone who could see inside its locks, and there was no telling where that path would lead. By the age of 13, Jonathan James had become more than a curious teenager. He had become a hacker, known online by the alias C0MRade. He didn't break into systems to destroy them. He broke in to understand them, to challenge himself, to prove he could. Each system had its own rules, its own locks, its own weaknesses, and Jonathan wanted to see them all. He learned quickly that the tougher the system, the more satisfying it was to crack. Small networks were easy, but the big targets drew him in. He thrived on the thrill of exploration, the power of knowing a system inside and out without being caught. Jonathan's reputation began to grow in online communities where other hackers shared knowledge and traded secrets. Sometimes he even offered guidance, pointing out flaws in security, helping administrators fix them, yet he rarely took credit. He was careful, meticulous, calculating every move. By 1999, at just 15 years old, Jonathan set his sights on NASA, specifically the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. He was ready for a challenge bigger than anything he had faced before, a system no one expected a teenager could touch. And in doing so, he was about to make history and draw the attention of the United States government. In the summer of 1999, Jonathan James decided it was time for his biggest challenge yet, NASA, the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. He didn't attack blindly. He studied the systems, learned their weaknesses, and planned each step with precision. Every command he typed was deliberate, every move calculated. For Jonathan, hacking wasn't about chaos, it was about mastery. Over time, he gained access to 13 NASA computers. Hidden among the data, he discovered proprietary software, a critical system that controlled temperature and humidity aboard the International Space Station. To the world, this code was essential to keeping astronauts alive. To Jonathan, it was a fascinating piece of government engineering, something to study, understand, and learn from. The US government valued this software at $1.7 million. Possessing the code didn't mean he could control the station, but it was still a massive security breach. NASA had to shut down parts of its network for almost 3 weeks, delaying operations and causing damages worth tens of thousands of dollars. The incident sent shockwaves through federal agencies. How could a teenager sitting in his bedroom break into one of the most secure systems on Earth? Jonathan later said the code was poorly written and that his only goal was education, not sabotage. To him, it was never about power or money. It was about skill, curiosity, and understanding how things worked. But the government, he had crossed a line. He had stepped into a world where intent no longer mattered, only the act itself. This breach made one thing clear. Jonathan James wasn't just another bright kid with a computer. He was a prodigy who had proven that no system, not even NASA's, was beyond reach, and his next target would test the limits of that genius and the patience of the US government. After the NASA breach, Jonathan James set his sights on the Pentagon, specifically the Defense Threat Reduction Agency in Beltsville, Virginia. This agency analyzed threats to the United States from nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, a system far more sensitive than anything he had tried before. He moved carefully, studying network layouts, probing for weak points, planning each step. Jonathan gained access to a server, installed a backdoor, and then watched. Quietly, he observed the traffic flowing through the network. Over time, he intercepted more than 3,300 messages between Detra staff. He retrieved 19 usernames and passwords. At least 10 of those accounts had access to military systems. For him, it remained an intellectual challenge, a test of skill, curiosity, and control. He did not set out to harm, nor to profit. The government saw it another way. This was no longer a teenage experiment. It was a direct intrusion into national security. Jonathan had crossed a line. He had become a target. The teen who once explored systems from his bedroom had now breached some of the most secure computers in the country. There would be consequences that would shape the rest of his life. It was an early morning in January 2000. Jonathan James had just turned 16 the month before when his mother entered his room and told him the words that would change everything. "The FBI is at the door." Agents flooded the house. They seized 5 computers, his Palm Pilot, stacks of CDs, and even a Star Trek book. Jonathan didn't resist. He admitted to what he had done and promised he'd never do it again. For 3 months, there was silence. Then, the charges came. The teenage hacker who had once viewed his work as a game was now facing the full force of the law. Jonathan became the youngest person ever convicted of violating U.S. cybercrime laws. If he had been an adult, he could have faced 10 years in prison. Instead, the U.S. District Court in Miami sentenced him to 6 months of house arrest, banned him from freely using computers, and required him to write letters of apology to NASA and the Department of Defense. But a probation violation, testing positive for drugs, sent him to a juvenile detention center for another 6 months. His father later said the experience broke something in him. The excitement that once drove Jonathan was replaced with fear, regret, and isolation. From that moment, he decided to leave hacking behind. Yet the past doesn't vanish easily. His name was already etched into cybercrime history, and the consequences of his actions and those connected to him were only beginning to unfold. By 2008, Jonathan James was 24. He hadn't gone to college. He didn't hold a steady job. He lived quietly with his brother in the same house where he grew up. His mother had died 6 years earlier from breast cancer. The bright, curious teen who once pushed at the edges of the most secure systems in the United States had withdrawn from the world. Then the past caught up. In 2008, the Secret Service arrived at his door. They tied his name to Albert Gonzalez, Christopher Scott, and a string of intrusions that stole credit and debit card data. Jonathan denied involvement, but agents searched his home, rifled through belongings, and found a suicide note and a gun. He was stunned, frightened, unsure what would come next. Jonathan believed he was being set up. He suspected Gonzalez, then working with federal authorities, was shifting blame, and that the system would pick the easiest target. Years before, he had learned how unforgiving law enforcement could be. The criminal justice system, in his view, was not always fair. Even a man who'd walked away from hacking could become a focus of suspicion. Under that pressure, his options narrowed. The fear, the sense of betrayal, the idea that he could be punished for crimes he insisted he did not commit, those burdens grew intolerable. What had started as curiosity and competition had mutated, in his mind, into entrapment, and the weight of it became crushing. On May 18, 2008, Jonathan James was found dead in his home. He had taken his own life, a single gunshot ending the story of a boy who once broke through the most secure systems in the United States. Beside him lay a note, messages to family and friends, passwords to his accounts, and his final thoughts about the investigation. He wrote of his distrust in the justice system, of his fear of being blamed for something he hadn't done. To him, sitting in jail for a crime he didn't commit wasn't justice, it was defeat. He wanted freedom, control, and dignity, even if it meant the end of his life. Jonathan's death shocked those who knew him. He wasn't a hardened criminal. He was a gifted, curious young man, failed by a system that didn't understand how to handle someone like him. Albert Gonzalez would later receive 20 years in federal prison for his role in the credit card thefts. Christopher Scott would serve 7 years. But Jonathan, he was never arrested, never tried, never sentenced. The fear of becoming a scapegoat, of being punished for crimes he did not commit, had become too heavy to bear. In the end, Jonathan James was remembered not for the systems he breached, but for his brilliance, his curiosity, and the tragedy of a life that ended far too soon. Jonathan James was more than just a hacker. He was a teenager with extraordinary talent, a mind that could see through the strongest digital locks. He was curious, relentless, and fearless. His story stands as both a warning and a reflection. A warning of what happens when brilliance meets misunderstanding, when talent is punished instead of guided, and when a system built to protect ends up breaking the very individuals it should nurture. The hacks he carried out, NASA, the Pentagon, were never acts of malice. They were challenges, explorations, a young mind testing the limits of what was possible. But the consequences that followed, his trial, his fear, his death, were devastating. His story became a case study in how society treats its prodigies and what happens when curiosity is mistaken for crime. Jonathan James's legacy is complex. He revealed the power of curiosity, the danger of underestimating youth, and the cost of a world unprepared to embrace genius. He was a prodigy, a pioneer, and ultimately a tragic figure. The lessons of his life still echo in the halls of cybersecurity today. The teen who hacked the most secure systems in America, the boy who challenged the impossible, will never be forgotten.